that probably is the most impressive thing LSU has done, even with games they've won, is playing South Carolina the way they play them that closely. I think some people will kind of lean on that and say, this is your proof that they are among the the top 4 to 5 teams in the country, because they did play so well in that game.
Is LSU one of the top teams in the country? LSU head coach Kim Mulkey thinks so.
A top team in the country, the defending national champion.
On the other hand, ESPN women's college basketball bracketologist Charlie Creme is on the fence and thinks that the best thing LSU has done this season was keep up with South Carolina. These are two very different statements, and honestly kind of confusing for Mulkey to be saying one thing and Charlie Creme to be saying another. We'll be right back with the rest of what Charlie Creme has to say about why he isn't buying into LSU being one of the top teams in the country right now.
It's your time to move things forward. U.S. Army Reserve.
The LSU women's basketball team only has 2 more regular season games left. They play Georgia Thursday night, Kentucky on Sunday. It will be senior day. LSU will recognize Angel Reese, Haley Van Liff. Even though those girls have another year of eligibility left, it is believed that they will move on to the WNBA. So
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think Angel is.
All right. Well, we'll see. We'll get let's bring in ESPN women's college basketball bracketologist. Charlie Creme joins us here on Tiger Rag Radio. We had Charlie on last year, and LSU won a national championship, so no pressure, Charlie. We'll see. LSU is number 3 in your latest bracket that you have out there right now, or your up-to-date bracket. You had them at 4 maybe about a week ago, but they looked really good last week, and to me, the biggest difference with this team, I know a lot of it is, hey, last year POA has made a big difference, but I just think as a collective group, they're just playing so much better defensively. And they're not just – I really felt in December and in January, they just wanted to try to outscore teams. They just wanted – everybody wanted their points. Everybody wanted – they wanted to score 85, 90 points, and let's see if the other team could beat you. And now they've realized, hey, defense wins championships, and that's, to me, the difference of this LSU women's basketball team in February as compared to January. What are you seeing out of them?
Yeah, I kind of agree. It's sort of played out, I think, in a lot of ways like we thought it would, except for maybe the missteps early in the season. Certainly the loss to Colorado and Las Vegas was not something, or the way it happened certainly was not something that most of us saw coming. And everybody largely had LSU projected as the number 1 or number 2 team in the country. There were some outliers who questioned things like defense and chemistry on offense with all of these high-end new faces, and a lot of other people, myself included, just kind of went, well, the talent will ultimately win out, and all those other things, they have a Hall of Fame coach to figure out, so they're going to figure it out. And they did have some cohesive issues defensively. You mentioned very much so. They weren't a unit playing defense. They were individuals, just like we talk about on offense, individuals trying to get theirs. Or on defense, there wasn't team defense happening. It was I'll try to shut down my player. I'll try to get a steal off the ball here, but it wasn't about how do we actually just lock down the other team. Well, now, as you mentioned, they're playing much better defense. They're just playing together better overall. I think they've largely, not entirely, but largely, the roles have been figured out. They kind of know who they need to lean on in key spots, who they can lean on in key spots, and what they have to do to shut the other team down. This is not the same team that lost to Auburn, for instance. That team didn't know what to do in crunch time. That team didn't know how to stop Auburn's best player. Now, if they played, and they have played subsequently, this LSU team is now very much capable of doing that, and I think we now kind of expect them to do that.
Charlie, you have them as a third seed, just like you had them, or just like they were last year. Do you honestly believe that they are not one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the country right now? And if so, how do you justify a third seed for them at that level?
Well, I'm not sure that they are one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the country right now. I think we got to take. There's a couple of things we still do have to take into consideration, and that is that this SEC is not the SEC of a few years ago.
Yeah, we were just talking about that in the break. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's still, I think, to some degree, a jury's still out mentality about. They certainly have looked better, but I do want to take a step back and recognize the fact that for 3 quarters the other day against Tennessee, they were pretty lousy on offense.
Right.
They were shooting about 28%, I think, through 3 quarters. It all came together in the 4th quarter, and we kind of talked about their ability now to play better in crunch time, and it came together at the right time, and they ended up winning that game comfortably. But they didn't look like, to me, a 3rd or 4th best team in the country for most of that game. So I'm still not entirely sure. And in terms of where I have them placed, it is still reflective of the resume, the overall season, some degree of how they are playing now. And I do, like we've talked about, I think they are playing better. But I'm not quite still sure how much better, or maybe not how much better, but how they would stack up against some of the other top flight programs in the country, because a couple things, they did play a better non-conference schedule this year, but they still played one that's among the weakest among the top 16 teams.
Okay, that makes sense.
They still only have one top 25 net win, which is the fewest among the teams, though tied with Gonzaga, among the teams that I currently have in the top 16. So there are some things to still wonder about. So I'm going to kind of hold off on elevating them or making any bold statements about whether they're a top 5 team in the country, because I'm just not quite sure yet.
Okay, so just play with me for a second. If they go undefeated for the rest of the season, get into the SEC tournament, and do something they don't usually do, and that is make it to the championship, and they're rematched with South Carolina in that championship, and they happen to beat South Carolina in the championship, is that going to throw your bracket into a zany world at that point?
It might, depending on what else happens in the rest of the country. But if they were to do all of that, then we're talking about. I still don't know about a 1 seed. We're talking about a 2 seed at that point, because none of this happens in a vacuum, right? So even if they do that, keep in mind though that these last 2 regular season games aren't going to help their resume at all. Unfortunately, going back to the fact that the SEC just isn't 5 years ago SEC, so they get no boost from anything until they get to Greenville. And even that, probably they don't get a boost until their semifinal game. But you kind of look at the teams ahead of them. There's some Pac-12 teams in there. Well, there's going to be some attrition. Probably somebody's going to have to lose in the Pac-12 tournament among Stanford, UCLA, USC. They all can't win it.
Right.
So if LSU is an SEC tournament champion, 2 of those teams, maybe all 3 of those teams, have another loss on their ledger. If somebody other than, say, a Virginia Tech, or if Iowa doesn't win the Big Ten tournament, there's some stumbling there that's going to go on. So that becomes a lot of shuffling, and I think LSU can certainly get to the 2 line. I don't. That's a big jump, though, to get all the way to one of the top 4 teams to be a number 1 seed.
Talking with Charlie Creme, ESPN Women's College basketball bracketologist. Charlie, how much of a concern is it the lack of? I mean, they really have one player that I think they can really count on, or at least they know what they're going to get coming off the bench. I mean, how big of that is a concern for you when you take a look at this LSU team?
Not so much anymore. I think they figured it out to some degree how they manage that. They have Kim Mulkey running things on the sideline. There's a bunch of teams that are kind of like Texas isn't very deep either. Iowa isn't particularly deep. Virginia Tech really leans on 2 players to have to deliver every night. NC State's not particularly deep. So what they're going up against in terms of what they would have to do to win another national championship, there's a lot of other teams in the same boat. And the talent level that they have is among the starting 5 is certainly among, if not the best. Now, South Carolina is a different animal. They're deep. Their starting 5 is great. They can shoot it. They can rebound it. They can defend it. Take them almost out of the mix in terms of competition and how you're measuring, because they're just different right now. I'm not saying they're unbeatable, but they're just different in terms of as we kind of stack things up. But LSU's depth problem is a problem that, as I mentioned, a bunch of other teams kind of are running with right now too. So I don't know how much of a disadvantage it would be in any one particular game in the Sweet 16 or the Elite 8.
Were you surprised, Charlie, to see LSU actually lead South Carolina most of that game and then honestly probably just lose it because they lost Angel when she fouled out with 4 minutes to play?
Well, it's kind of 2 things with that. That probably is the most impressive thing LSU has done, even with games they've won, is playing South Carolina the way they play them that closely. I think some people will kind of lean on that and say, this is your proof that they are among the top 4 to 5 teams in the country, because they did play so well in that game. The other thing it told me is that despite all the kind of things that happened early in the season and all of the different opinions that people have on Angel Reese, she's vitally important to this team, the most important player on this team, the best player on this team, and they really can't do anything of note in the postseason without her, A, being on the floor, and B, producing at a high level.
When you talked about the Pac-12, you talked about UCLA. I kind of wonder how they're still ranked that way. Is it just because they've had so many injuries, and that's attributed to their losses recently? And the same thing with Iowa. They've seemed to be getting beat up badly a couple of times, and yet they're still hanging out in the top 4.
Yeah, I mean, Iowa, I think, is certainly slipped out of that range, and UCLA is not quite in the top 4. I will say this: the healthy UCLA before Lauren Betts got hurt, and before Lauren Betts got hurt. Now she's back, but they're clearly having some trouble reincorporating her. They were definitely, at that point in time, they were definitely the second best team in the country. I think there was almost no argument about it at that point in time. That's certainly not the case now. But that part of their resume still exists. The injuries still do exist. And the committee has kind of a difficult job. I guess by proxy, it's been a difficult job for me evaluating some of these teams who have lost players temporarily and knowing what they were before, knowing what happened during that injury time, and then what they've become since those players have returned. It's almost harder to do that than it is to measure a team that lost a player for the season.
Charlie, thanks a lot for your time tonight, man. We'll keep an eye on the bracket that you have out there. It should be very interesting, and I think for LSU fans, they're looking forward to another deep run here.
It's very probable.
Yep. All right, Charlie, thanks a lot, man. We appreciate it.
Learning and reading through cuisine? Huh? Join the East Baton Rouge Parish Library for its One Book, One Community series in March and April. Come by your nearest library and get a copy of the 2024 selection, Tasting History by Max Miller, to explore the past and immerse yourself in culture through cuisine. To learn more, visit readonebook.org.
Well, Charlie, it's interesting to listen to you go back and forth throughout this interview on whether or not LSU is one of the top teams. You go from talking about their lack of depth not being a huge issue because plenty of other great teams have a lack of depth, to the only thing LSU has done this season was keep up with South Carolina, to ending with it's probable that LSU goes all the way this season. And while I agree with you on two of your points, one being the lack of depth not being a major issue anymore, and two, there being a probable chance for LSU to go all the way, I just can't see eye to eye with you that the best thing LSU has done this season was keep up with South Carolina. LSU's partially a new team with only 3 players from the national championship team and a freshman starter. LSU still went 24-4 and 11-3 in the SEC to this point. That isn't something just any team can necessarily do with a brand new team. Kim Mulkey knows how to build a basketball team, and she plays to win. It's not a coincidence that she's won 4 NCAA championships as a coach, and she knows how to play when it matters. Tonight, the number 9 Lady Tigers will be on the court against Georgia at 8 p.m. on ESPN2. Stay tuned to TigerRank.com for more updates on all things LSU, and I'll be back later.
I play to win.